Great. Well, welcome to everybody. We're glad you could join us. And I'm going to let Jeannie and Jonathan get right to it. But in the meantime, I'll just, as far as any sort of house rules, please, Jonathan and Jeannie are both really great with taking questions. And you can ask, or if you want to raise your digital hand or drop it in the chat, or just wave, wave your hand. And we'll go from there. So with no further ado, Jeannie, do you want to get us started?
Great, thanks. This is our second Learn About DOT happy hour. So we're dissecting the American Jobs Plan. This is part two. Part one was on, what was number one? What was number one?
Hang on, let's
Down, lost me. So this is part two. It's on safety because safety is job one. Part two will be on, part three will be on social equity. Part four will be on jobs. It's all about the economy. So without further ado, I'd like the next slide. And why safety? I'm glad someone is here from the Vision Zero Network. I'm very passionate about that. We want people to recognize their regions. So we're kind of structured and organized around the FTA region. So I'm in region 10, Jonathan French is in region 1. And we expect people to be in these different regions around the country. Next slide. And safety is so important. It's, I wanted to quote something from 99% Invisible City, a book, but also the podcast. Transportation safety is addressing a different pandemic, and I think people are sympathetic to this. Our contemporary well-being owes much to medical breakthroughs like antibiotics and vaccines. We're all familiar with that, but a case can be made that the warning lights, traffic signals, road markers, and safety symbols that dot the built landscape all do their part to keep you in one piece as the world has sped up and invisible dangers have emerged. Visual designs have evolved to keep up. And I think we're all very, very familiar with that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Jeannie. So one thing we've heard quite a bit about is road user deaths. They have been decreasing since the 1970s and reached a low point in 2010 and around 2010, 2011. But then, as you see, they've been climbing back up ever since 2015. And last year, they rose sharply. We were looking at around 42,000 deaths, and that percentage, we were looking at an 8% increase in spite of the vehicle miles traveled dropping by over 10%. So we're really back to where we were in the early 2000s as far as road user deaths. And the pedestrian death rate actually rose by 21%, according to the Governor's Highway Safety Association, with the overall deaths up about 4.8% from 2019. So really not a great picture here, but how do we compare to the rest of the world is a question that we should be asking. So when we look at this, you can see that this chart right here compares all the other countries per 100,000 population, and this is from the World Health Organization, of road user deaths. So if you look at these countries on the right here, you have Sweden, you have the UK, you have Japan, you have Germany, Spain, France. Now we're getting toward the middle here. You have the Bahamas, you have Cuba, and you have Egypt. We're still not seeing the US yet. And where's the United States? Way over here.
Just above Kazakhstan.
Yeah. And also behind Russia. So, fewer people per 100,000 have died on Russian roads than US roads. So, kind of let that sink in for a minute. So there's a lot more that we can be doing. And, this really should be embarrassing and unacceptable, but it also has a huge financial cost.
Yeah,
I mean, if you
bring him in, I have a jury duty tomorrow, so he'll bring me a soap and
could we ask folks to mute, please?
Yeah, I think it's Bill, and I think he thought that
I'm
he
sorry.
muted before he stepped away.
Okay.
So sorry, Jonathan.
No worries. No worries.
Yes.
We'll chastise him when he gets back.
This is happy hour.
Have a good night.
All right. All right, so road user deaths, like I was mentioning, there's a huge financial cost to this and the cost of inaction. Now these come from the National Safety Council these figures come from the National Safety Council. And if you take that $1.7 million figure, whoops, sorry. Go back here. If you take that $1.7 million figure and you multiply it by that 42,000 deaths, you get a cost of in excess of 70 billion. So there's not only a human cost to this, but a huge economic cost. And we really need to ask ourselves, how do we change this? Now, fortunately, we're already beginning to talk about a solution. And everybody, meet Rhonda Bout. Hi, Rhonda. Well, you'll be seeing more of her with Build the Air in the future. And yeah, so how do we fund more roundabouts? Well, the answer to that is the American Jobs Plan. There's a lot of money for roundabouts and other safety projects in there. And roundabouts can solve a lot of problems, as kind of Rhonda was mentioning. They reduce road user fatalities by 90 to 100%. But they need the funding in the American Jobs Plan to become a reality. And there she goes. So the consequences of inaction, you've seen the statistics, but this really is the worst case scenario realized if we ignore infrastructure. And for folks who don't recognize this picture, this is the I-35 West Mississippi River Bridge in Minneapolis, and when it collapsed in 2007. And this collapse led to the rigorous bridge inspections and the increase of bridge replacements all across the country. Now, this bridge had been rated as structurally deficient first in 1990, and that was 17 years prior to its collapse. A study in 2001 had pointed out how a single structural failure could cause collapse because of the bridge design, and that means it was fracture critical. In 2005, the bridge had finally been designated for replacement, and that replacement was going to occur in 2020. On August 1st in 2007, 13 years prior to that, it collapsed into the Mississippi River, killing 13 and injuring 145. And the failure was due to the inadequate design for the structural load. And then it had construction equipment because construction was occurring and it was just in the exact right spot for that failure to occur. But this collapse still spurred states to act. Everybody was saying, we've got to do something about bridges in this country. And there was a real serious look on bridges. And, why is this important? Well, it's because of recent events here. And basically we did avoid a catastrophe here. This failure on the Hernando de Soto Bridge on I-40 in Memphis, this was caught before you had a catastrophic failure. Really, because one had already happened, in Minnesota those years prior. Those bridge inspections were occurring. And even though the bridge inspector wasn't documenting it correctly, they were still having regular routine inspections so that this failure didn't become a total, complete fracture and a catastrophic collapse. If there hadn't been an inspection in 2021, who knows what would have happened. So, the moral of this whole thing is we cannot ignore our bridges and roads because people will die if we do. And not just with bridge collapses, but run off the road crashes, unsafe crossings, things that don't really make the national news, but they still impact the communities we live in, both emotionally and economically. So that's why the American Jobs Plan and those safety initiatives are so important. So what is in the American Jobs Plan? Well, there's $115 billion to fix or modernize roads and bridges. And then there's $100 billion of that is really for safety. So quite a bit of it out of that $150 billion or $115 billion is for safety. And the initiatives are the quote, fix it right, which is your upgrades to your safety, which includes the geometry, clear zone, which is roadside hazards, making sure those are clear, the roadsides are clear of hazards, guardrail, and any structural deficiencies that are there. So there's about 50 billion earmarked for that. And then you have just the bridge investment. And we're talking the 10,000 worst small bridges. And these are ones that aren't on the national highway system. So these aren't going to be like your major Golden Gate Bridge or, your Tappan's, the big major bridges that you hear about. These are going to be more like the bridges that you may pass over every day that you may not even know about, because you may pass over what's called a box culvert, which is basically, and if it's long enough, if the span's big enough, it's a bridge. And so there are a lot of these that are, that are structurally deficient that need fixing because, even if one of these fails, it could mean, a whole change in a route for, a trucking company or something like that, that could cost, a lot of dollars and, cause a lot of delay in shipping or travel or anything like that. So, and then you have your 10 economically significant bridges. These are kind of your more bigger bridges, your more substantial bridges. And, so those that are in need of reconstruction. So there's about 40 billion total for this whole program. And then you have the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is your bike and pedestrian facilities. And there's typically about 850 million a year for this program. But the American Jobs Plan actually plans on having $5 billion additional money to this. So there can be a lot of safety projects with bike and pedestrian facilities with that money. And then finally, we have the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Project, CMAQ. And you wouldn't think necessarily safety with this, but again, roundabouts have been built by this, and yes, Rhonda, yes, someone said roundabout. These have been constructed all over the country using these funds, and you get the environmental benefit and you get the reduction of congestion, but they also have that safety benefit. So it's just that added bonus. So that's why, that 5 billion, you could build quite a few roundabouts even with just 5 billion. So, and then there's 20 billion for actual, dedicated transportation safety programs. And you start out with the Safe Streets for All, which is the idea of funding those local Vision Zero programs. And there's about 10 million there. And then you have an extra allocation to Federal Highways Highway Safety Improvement Program. Typically, that's about 2.5 billion per year. This is proposing, because the American Jobs Plan's over 8 years, this is proposing about $1 billion extra per year added to that. And then you have safe driving behaviors from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And then it's not necessarily transportation related, but pipelines do fall under the purview of USDOT. So there's pipeline safety modernization grants as well. So to talk a little bit about Vision Zero, this really started in Sweden in the late 1990s. They were really the drivers of this. And then it's kind of spread worldwide. We'd mentioned, you saw those countries over to the right, well, those countries, have embraced Vision Zero and have done, implemented and have funded the things that they need to do to reduce their road user deaths. In the United States here, we do have states that are committed to the vision, but you have large municipalities such as Boston, Chicago, Denver, New York City, Los Angeles, Houston, and most recently, Kansas City had added to that in 2020, have committed to an actual Vision Zero, target. And a lot of these communities, a lot of these cities are choosing 2050. But it was interesting to find out Kansas City had actually chosen the date of 2030. So they've actually gone, kind of above and beyond, and that's really good to see. We really do need something here. Federal Highway is really yet to adopt any target date, but organizations such as the National Safety Council, the Vision Zero Network, the Road to Zero Coalition are really going to be pushing the Biden administration to adopt that, at least that 2050 date, because that's really, we need to set a target to actually have a goal to get there. All right, so what does Federal Highway have? If they don't have Vision Zero, what they have is what's called the Safe Systems Approach. And there are 6 core principles to that. basically death and serious injury is unacceptable. So that's kind of the vision zero without a target date. But humans make mistakes. Humans are vulnerable. Responsibility is shared. That means your road users, your system managers, your law enforcement, emergency responders, and vehicle manufacturers all have a responsibility for safety. Safety is proactive and redundancy is critical. Making sure that we have, multiple layers of safety systems in place on our highway system. And then you have the 5 elements that are incorporated in this. And you have safe road users, safe vehicles, safe speeds, safe roads, and post-crash care. So these 6 core principles and the 5 elements to that are all incorporated into the part of that safe systems approach. And the way that Federal Highway does this is they do it through the Highway Safety Improvement Program, as we mentioned earlier. And there are 4 components to this. The first is the Strategic Highway Safety Plan. This is required by law for each state who's looking for these highway safety improvement funds, and it has to be updated every 5 years. And it addresses the 4 E's of highway safety: engineering, education, enforcement, and your emergency medical services, with data-driven and comprehensive planning. And just to show you kind of an example here of some of these, this is my state's Strategic Highway Safety Plan. You can see here, again, there's your 4 E's: your education, your engineering, enforcement, and your emergency services. And you go through this thing, and here are their focus areas of the plan right here: lane departure, seatbelt usage, younger drivers, large animals, moose and deer crashes. This may not be an issue in every state, but it is for us. And we have, even motorcycles. That's a big issue in Maine right now, motorcycle crashes. So, we have all of these focus areas, but then you scroll down here, and this is, you get your focus area champions as part of that. But here's the key right here: driving towards 0 deaths. And there it is right there. Overall safety goal: drive safety performance to 0 deaths. So now we take a look at Texas. Texas actually has an actual website devoted to it that you can click on. And these are really their focus areas: distracted driving, intersection safety, pedestrian safety, impaired driving, older road users, speeding, and roadway and lane departures. But again, here you go, on the road to 0. So that 0, that vision 0, that road to 0, this is a common theme with states and municipalities and Federal Highway itself. So it's there, even though people haven't totally committed to vision 0 in a lot of ways. But it's good to have that there. But again, there's a lot more we can do. But in the Strategic Highway Safety Plan is really where that focus starts. Going back here, so you have the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, and then you have the State Highway Safety Plan. Now, each state has 5 target areas that they have to address. They have to address the number of fatalities, the rate of fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles traveled, the number of serious injuries, the rate of serious injuries per 100 million vehicles miles traveled, and then the number of non-motorized fatalities and number of non-motorized serious injuries. And that's pretty much your cyclists and your pedestrians. I mean, that's what that figure addresses. Each state has to report each year on the progress they make for those 5 initiatives. And then any projects that they have as part of their highway safety improvement program, they have to address what they've actually put in their Strategic Highway Safety Plan. And then those get added to what's called the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP. And that's a 4-year program for all federally funded projects that the state is trying to do with the transportation.
Jonathan, can I ask you a question on that slide?
Sure.
The EMS portion of that, what does that look like? Is that their access to roads, their ability to navigate roads in an emergency? What does that mean?
Well, we can go back to Maine's highway safety plan here. And if you look, let's see. So you have different leads that take on the different pieces of this. And let me go back to the actual leads here. So here you go. You have the emergency area, emergency services and incident management. So let's take a look at that. So we have in Maine, we have what's called a life flight. And I'm sure, I don't know if other states have something similar, but that's something that's really critical for any crashes or anything like that that occur on the highway in a kind of a rural area. So that's a big part of the safety component. Let's see, there it is right here. And you also have the other piece of this too, which is interesting, is that, Maine emergency vehicles experience crashes too. So there's a safety component to first responders and their safety while responding to emergencies. So in that case, that's what in Maine, that's what we're basically trying to do, is looking at that piece of it, looking at the reporting systems that we have for emergency management, making sure that the data, is consistent and we're getting it to where it needs to go. And then looks like basically education and licensing is another piece, another core component. So I think it varies on each state, what states decide to do with their EMS, but it's a critical component of safety just because first responders are a critical component of safety in every state.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. So going to the next slide, we have the Railroad Highway Crossing Program, and this is basically your elimination of hazards at railroad crossings. And then you have your high-risk rural road program. So this is required if states have high fatality rates on their rural roads, they're required to actually have a section in their highway safety plan, plus have dedicated funding from their highway safety funds to certain projects to improve this. And that's something, federal highway is, kind of enforces that and provides that funding. But that's kind of how states address those high risk rural roads, because as we've heard in previous presentations, about half, of user deaths occur kind of on those rural road systems. So, that's why we need to have these programs in place. So some of the project types, I have 4 highway safety improvement projects, include intersection safety improvements, such as roundabouts. And then you have signals, and there's Rhonda again. Rumble strips, pavement shoulder widenings, you have road hazard elimination and road safety audits. And these projects must meet that highway safety improvement criteria and be consistent with the strategic highway safety plan initiatives. And I had mentioned, the high risk rural road program was a funding source, and then you actually have safe routes to school. That's another funding source that can build those facilities, in school areas where you're having kids. And if you don't have the sidewalk, and the bike facilities and things like that, that can be some funding, to tap into. And that funding typically on these projects is 90% federal and 10% state. So it's actually a little bit more than the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program that commonly funds a lot of federal programs. These safety programs are really the federal highways really kicking in most of the money. So the Highway Safety Manual, this is something that a lot of states are using as kind of a main tool, because it includes the screening, safety project evaluations, design alternatives, a cost to benefit analysis, and then priority rankings. So this is something that's fairly new. Some manuals and things have been around for decades, but this came out in the 2010s. This is fairly new for states to have this tool to be able to better look at projects, kind of weigh those projects and decide which ones they want to address, the things in their highway safety plan that they want to address. with certain projects based on what they get out of the highway safety manual. So we mentioned driver behavior, and these are the focus areas. This is kind of the risky behavior that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is really focused on. Because distracted driving, we've lost over 3,000 people in 2019 due to distracted driving. And seatbelt use, you wouldn't really think of this still being an issue, but because there's 90% compliance, but basically 47% of passenger vehicle occupants killed in 2019 were not wearing a seatbelt. So, you know, we can definitely do better there. Speeding. In 2018, there were over 9,000 deaths related to excess speed. And, you know, as seeing those numbers in 2020 and knowing what we know about why those deaths had occurred because people weren't on the roads, I think you'll find that a lot more than 9,000, you know, were killed in 2020. And then you have, you know, drugs and alcohol use, over 10,000 deaths in 2019 due to drunk driving crashes. But here's a figure that's really interesting. 65% of drivers in a fatal crash tested positive for one substance when they were tested at a trauma center. So think about that, 65%. And then you have drowsy driving. We just had a incident that happened from my hometown, actually, where we had three pedestrians, 2 women and their 1-year-old granddaughter of one of them were hit and killed by someone who potentially fell asleep at the wheel. And almost 700 people died due to drowsy driving related crashes in 2019. So, you know, you may not think of it as a major safety issue, but, you know, just that, you know, people walking on the side of the road, you think drunk driving, you think, you know, distracted driving, but drowsy driving, you know, is a real issue as well. But you look at all these areas and you add them up, you know, 3,000, 9,000, 10,000, 700. You start, you know, you apply $1 billion to this, you get some better education, you get some better enforcement. You know, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration can really do a lot with $1 billion to try to drive these deaths down. You know, and that really takes us, you know, closer and closer to that Vision Zero mark. So, you know, there's, you know, it may not seem like much, $1 billion, but, you know, an agency like this can really do a lot with that. And we do have vehicle technology. You know, we're hearing more about autonomous vehicles and, you know, the systems in there. I mean, simply like just the ones that, you know, you get in the car and you don't have your seatbelt on and your car lets you know, or, you know, you have lane departure warnings, or, you know, different technology and things, but we're not fully autonomous yet. So it's important that we're spending $1 billion on driver behavior, because, you know, we can do something in the meantime before we get into the autonomous world and, you know, maybe think that we don't need to take as much responsibility. But now we really do have that responsibility, and we really do need to put some resources into driver behavior.
Jonathan, can I ask, are you any statistics as states are legalizing marijuana, any changes in the driving under the influence type of incidents?
I know a lot of states have brought it up as a concern, the ones that are legalizing. I don't know of any statistics as of yet that have been cited for, you know, increase in that, you know, basically driving under the influence under marijuana.
Okay.
And I'll just throw out there, Washington State has been tracking it because they've had legalized marijuana for a number of years. And one of the things the Washington Traffic Safety Commission is looking at is, are people getting stoned and driving after they get stoned? And what they're finding is that people are, you know, buying their drugs, taking it home, and not really driving afterwards. So it's a little different than alcohol, like going to a baseball game. You're more likely, they're less likely to find that people are smoking the pot and then driving. So it's just one small thing.
Thank you.
My son hasn't gotten the memo, it's happy hour, so I apologize for that. All right, so I'll turn it over to Jeannie to talk about some of the other safety measures that are part of the American Jobs Plan. Oh, Jeannie, I think you're muted.
Rail safety grants are included in some of the rail projects, and this is grade separating some of the rail projects, or rail crossings, and that's been a long need. Maria Cantwell from our state mentions it every time, and she's head of the Senate Committee on Transportation. She'll mention it every time. Advancing transformative projects. These are, this is where innovation comes from, and it's partnerships with private industry. But in the American Jobs Plan, they talk about things like advanced pavements, recycle carbon dioxide, but also other innovations that safe, equitable, sustainable transportation systems. So those, there's a dedicated fund of $25 billion for to support ambitious projects that have tangible benefits. So some of these safety ideas will be within that. And then pipeline safety grants, obviously, from the Colonial Pipeline issues, how they could have been hijacked. It's a big safety issue. While we might not think about pipelines in traffic safety, the Olympic pipeline disaster, which was up in Bellingham in 1999, 3 people were killed, but you can see the devastation of this. It's a, it's something that's unchecked and it's under the ground, so you're not paying attention to it. But pipeline safety can be, very dangerous and have substantial consequences. So those are some of the things that would be included in the safety grant in the American Jobs Plan. That's it. Great to see folks here. Let's see what people have questions about.
Anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
Yeah.
Massachusetts loves our roundabouts, I guess. We have a lot.
Yeah, and I could certainly fill a whole hour about it, but Rhonda, we're here to talk about all the safety aspects of the American Jobs Plan. So yes, with that, open it up for questions.
Well, this is a question we've talked about before, and with someone here from Vision Zero, I'll ask again, why Oregon is having so much trouble implementing Vision Zero. I mean, Portland specifically, it's just been a pretty dismal failure, and how could that change if the American Jobs Plan passes? What additional resources, what additional tools will they have?
I think you're really looking at that Safe Streets for All initiative. I mean, that's where that $10 billion, and I'm sorry I didn't mention Portland as one of the cities, but it is, Portland has committed to Vision Zero. So, I would imagine that part of that 10 billion would be headed that way. And really the whole thing that's been, causing Vision Zero to not be as successful here in the United States is just that lack of dedicated funding. You're not seeing, and the other thing too is, as I mentioned, Federal Highway really hasn't adopted the 2050 date, while these other, so there's some centralized support, but it really is kind of up to each individual state or municipality to kind of do their own thing. So if there's an actual program to funnel money, I would think there would be some sort of coordination within that program to, keep track of where that money is being spent and how it's being spent, just like any other federal program. So I think that's where you're going to see it, is that Safe Streets for All initiative.
Okay.
And I'll just say that, what the federal government can do, even though each of these states is very independent and has their own laws, have their own highway laws, have their own speed limits. what you'll find from the feds is carrots and sticks. So they'll be encouraging. These Vision Zero. That whole safety initiative is really geared toward moving the conversation. So I think they will be looking at, different strategies. I think what they're looking at is this the notion of kinetic energy, for example. The speed for which you get hit is going to determine outcomes as far as injuries and deaths. So they're looking, directly at kinetic energy. Roundabouts would be a way of deflecting this kinetic energy, and the other thing that a lot of states are looking at is rethinking how they set speeds. It's a big push to say we set these speeds. Back in the days, these engineers came up with this way of setting a speed to say that the philosophy was, well, about 85% of the people are going this speed, so let's set the speed there because that's what people will drive. And now we're changing our philosophy to say, you know what? Even though people are driving fast, I think we could push it down. We can start lowering those speeds and use different strategies to lower speed. You don't have to be going. The difference between 35 miles an hour and 25 miles an hour is dramatic in injury and serious injury.
This also brings up a question. And for those of you on the call today, if you haven't been listening, please check out the Move the Era podcast that we have links to on our website at buildtheera.com. But you mentioned, Jeannie, in one of the episodes, an experiment, I believe in your state, using dots and saying, please keep the idea is keep 2 dots distance between. And if I'm paraphrasing this right, you implemented the system there, you put all these dots on a stretch of road, and it turned out that nobody could visualize what 2 dots, and they were actually essentially using 10 dots of space, and it caused traffic havoc, which I get. But my question was that I was left with after listening to that is, why did they scrap it so fast? Why did they not stick with it and educate and get people to embrace it? And that's not just this issue. I see that in other things where they try things and it seems like they don't give it enough time. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think I'm going to say what a couple of my podcast guests have said. Maybe others have heard this as well. What Ted was trying to say was, let some of this comes from experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we are held to this standard because of liability. So we're very cautious about these things. So people get panicky and they want to make everything as safe as possible. So they might say 2 dots or 10 dots. But in his case, what he was saying, this was something that they had picked up in Europe. The Washington State Patrol had gone to Europe. They'd seen these things where people were told to keep a certain amount of distance between them and the car in front of them. It would reduce rear ends. So people were doing that, but the distance was too much and it failed dramatically. And the press was there. And when Ted, state traffic engineer at the time, was asked about this, he knew he was going to get broiled. He knew he was going to get grilled and broiled, and there's a fear of that in state agencies to experiment, or in any public works. There's a drive to be more cautious than to be more experimentative. And he said, first I'm going to tell you, we have a pretty good safety record. We have a safe record because we experiment a little bit, we push the envelope, and now we'll take your questions. So this was an experiment. Maybe it didn't go so the way we wanted it to, and I don't think he was abandoning it. I think they just realized that it wasn't the smartest thing to do. Variable speed limits. We have these signs all over the region that say, you're coming at the sign starts at 70, and then if it gets congested, the speeds will lower, and they're supposed to vary the speed. And I don't know that they are that effective, because sometimes they are, but I don't think they are as effective as when we first installed them. So it's a little bit of an experiment, but the goal is always to keep things more safe. And it didn't hurt anything. It just didn't really maybe help. But I think one thing that's really changed is we have a ton more data. All of these vehicles have so much more information. You'll hear Laura Schul from Streetlight, and she's going to be one of our guests coming up. But she's partnering with Ford, and Ford is, we used to just look at data as far as like an accident has been reported. So it falls into the system and someone got hurt. So then we have a piece of data. The near misses, we never heard about those. They weren't recorded, they weren't reported. I didn't really know about that. But Ford now is reporting when that automatic braking system starts, if you're in a car and it starts going, da, 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 and you know that, you're near pedestrians or something, that vehicle with, some anonymousness, privacy to the driver, but it still reports that at this intersection, this happened. And if you get a plethora of them, engineers like us can say, oh, okay, maybe we need to change the signal timing or put in a roundabout. So.
Is there any data on how people have a tendency to violate the speed limit? I know back during the first oil crisis, all the speed limits in this area were lowered to 55, and nobody paid any attention to that. Unless there was the cops had a speed trap, and then the little headlights got flashing all over the place. Is there any data on how apt people are to ignore speed limits, especially on highways?
I think that's easily collected information, actually, more so now than before. And I think that's something that people will be watching now, especially since the post-pandemic or during the pandemic, speeds increased.
So, we have a little bit of time left, and the big question, of course, for a lot of us is, how are we going to get the American Jobs Plan passed so that we can start implementing these things and advocating for them at our state level? For those of you that are new to our discussions, that's part of our mission here at Build the Era, is to educate, but to help you advocate for the change you want to see in your community, in your state, in your city, and in your neighborhood. And so that's our big picture goal. Jonathan and Jeannie, do you want to give us any thoughts on where you see the negotiations? I see Republicans came back with a nearly $1 trillion plan, counter proposal. Any thoughts, any instinct on what you're seeing, what you think is happening with all the sausage making?
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Sure. I'm a little bit more somewhat optimistic than some. I see, the effort. There are things that are in there. I mean, like when you're talking about resiliency, for instance, that's a word that's kind of been foreign to Republicans. And, I think the one thing that I've seen in a consistent theme, which is interesting, is the kind of the electric vehicles, and it was really clear from the minute that Pete first had his hearing with the Senate committee that they were not sold on electric vehicles as kind of the administration was. And you can see that by what they've put in their plan. I mean, the president proposed, I think it was 174 billion, and they proposed 4. So, it's quite a gap there. And also you can see the actual reauthorization bill, because we're talking about the American Jobs Plan, we're talking about this package that the Republicans put together, but then you have the reauthorization bill, which is in there, which is kind of interesting because it's got components of the American Jobs Plan in it. So, and I think there was a lot of work done there, and I'm really optimistic about what's in there. Even some organizations, they're not going to endorse it and they're not going to be happy about it, but I've heard some say it's a good start, or it's, it's the direction we want to go in, so I hate to think that's as good as we're going to get, with this Congress, but, the fact that we're talking about resiliency, we have resiliency grants in there, the fact that we have, and again, it's not really popular, but it's groundbreaking. But the fact that we're that they're talking about a national road user fee pilot, that, or mileage-based user fee pilot, that is huge. compared to these kind of individual corridors and states that have kind of been doing their own thing. Now you're looking at potentially a centrally coordinated effort, again, which is something that is crucial to something really getting adopted all across the country, is the federal government doing some coordination and having some legislation that spells it out. So, I really, you look at that, you look at what's happening with that Republican bill, you look what's happening at the Senate committee level. And, I think, and the other thing I've pointed out too is that, Republicans really don't have a choice, because if they want earmarks, they're going to have to agree to something to get their projects in one of these bills. So, I think there really is some pressure to do something, because I think they realize they can't say no, not on infrastructure, because it is, even in their own states, they keep talking about, the core infrastructure, your physical infrastructure. Everybody thinks of infrastructure, road and bridges and drinking water and broadband, and, those are important. And because they know, if they pass on that, and, their constituents are going to let them have it. So, there's pressure to do something there. I think they can get away, some of the electric vehicle charging, or some of the things like the community reconnections and things like that, that turns into and especially in trains and transit, those turn into sort of political things. So then they can sort of justify not really supporting those, because depending on their constituencies. So, but really the meat and bones of the infrastructure piece, the transportation infrastructure, and the other thing is the American Jobs Plan is popular with the majority of Americans too. So you got that, you've got the fact that everybody really wants, it wants what they call core infrastructure. And, the majority of people want the American Jobs Plan. The Republicans just cannot say no. That is not an option for them.
I think we've seen, the work that Pete especially, but others have been doing, has made even journalists, I feel, more articulate and more conversant and more comfortable with the topics related to infrastructure than they were even 2 months ago. When it was like this three-headed cat to them 2 months ago. Now reporters are digging down into the more, I would say, more nuanced levels of discussion, and having good discussions with Pete and other officials. And I think that's why we're seeing the favorability for this actually going up even more, as we're in all of your local media markets in one way or another. And for those on this, this today, again, part of our mission is to hopefully make you more comfortable with these topics, to understand at a higher level, and to help advocate. So that advocation may look like writing a letter to your local community paper to say, hey, I really want to see the American Jobs Plan passed, and this is why. We have, grade separation issues in this kind of, I live in Portland, Oregon. We have all sorts of bridge issues that need these dollars. And I'm even seeing our local mayor speaking about it here in Portland today. So for those of you on this, please stay in touch and reach out to us for ways to reach out to your local media and influencers.
Listen to, it's top of mind to most politicians. And originally the line they had drawn in the sand was, it's not infrastructure. It's not, and it wasn't even just, it wasn't infrastructure. It isn't roads and bridges. They were very specific with that argument. And yet I just read Kathy McMorris Rogers, get all your legislators' newsletters and read them, because they're all talking about infrastructure. And hers today was really interesting. She said how important broadband was. I was like, oh, okay. And I think they muddy the water around the Highway Trust Fund. That's the thing. The American Jobs Plan isn't the Highway Trust Fund. And sometime, when we get a little further down the pike, we should explain the difference between that. But the mileage-based user fee, that's going to help them with the Highway Trust Fund to collect user fees to continue that. And that's great. That's over here. This American Jobs Plan is kind of, it's paid for a different way, or it's just a first stab at this stuff. So they're a little bit different, and it's about jobs. So that's going to be our last webinar.
Julie, do you mind dropping the link to the 2nd and 3rd June
Not at all.
into the
Yep.
chat? That would
Give me
be
just a
great.
moment and I'll do that. No problem.
Sure. Folks, we have 2 more webinars coming up this month that'll be, very educational. Again, giving us all this background that we need on this topic that is on one hand very complex, but I think thanks to Jeannie and Jonathan have made it very understandable for those of us that don't work in it. And as you spend more time in learning and talking, and the minute you leave your home, however you move, whether it's on a bike or it's a car or it's a streetcar or a bus or a train, you realize this is all transport and this is all important, and this does. And as Pete said, and lots of others have said, all of these political things are local. And that's what we're trying to help. So I do hope that you will join us here for these next 2, the links there in the chat. Thank you, Julie. Does anyone else have any other questions? Not hearing any. Well,
So
Jeannie,
just one thing, could I say just a couple things here
of course you
before
can.
we wrap up? So you see on here that we got those next sessions, but something that, just to consider too, as we'd mentioned, certain cities have Vision Zero organizations, and that's a great way to get involved, locally with that. And then, looking at the strategic highway safety plan, and I'll drop a link here in the chat that Federal Highway has, that you can it's an interactive map. You can click on your state and you can go to your actual highway safety plan, because it sounds kind of mundane a little bit, but really that strategic highway safety plan is what your state is planning on doing to address highway safety and transportation safety in your state. And that's really where everything starts, is that strategic highway safety plan. That's what everybody goes back to. So it's an important document. And if you get involved with like safety organizations and community organizations, things like that, you might actually have a chance to be part of that strategic highway safety plan process, because part of the education component is those advocacy organizations and those, participating in shaping that plan. And so that's the question is, how can we get involved to shape these plans, in our states, to make sure that our state DOTs are addressing, the needs that are out there that we're observing.
Jonathan had shared that, and I looked up Oregon this week, and we have 1,999 bridges that are in various states of repair that need lots of repairs, in the total estimated of $2.3 billion. And that's one state. And we're not even, other states like Iowa and things that have so many more bridges. Where's that money coming from? Well, that money is coming from the American Jobs Plan. And that's why it's so important that we get this passed. So, again, I want to keep that focus on that local, because it's not just some far off state. It's not just some far off issue. It's probably that road. And as Jonathan said, you're driving on some of these and you don't even recognize them as bridges. Because I'll tell you, after looking at the list and the bridges, quote, bridges around my home, I didn't even ever thought of those as bridges.
Yeah, and if it's not in that plan, it's not going to get funded. That's the first step. And unfortunately, that highway strategic plan is a huge, and it's a huge list that you take small bites from. Getting those funded takes a long time too. So a lot of this is, it's a long process, and I feel like the last 4 years we didn't get much done. We just built our backlog.
I have to say, I love that, to Jonathan's point, I really love that they're, the folks that are trying to buck this, the Republicans that are kind of seeing it's in their best interest. So I feel like this is a unique piece of legislation in that way, in that you typically see Republicans just saying, nope, 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 not going to do it. But, it's going to hurt them. It's going to hurt their state in the end if they don't, agree to some of this and get some of this funding for their state. So
and the jobs that it
Right.
creates.
And the jobs it creates,
The
exactly.
blue collar jobs that don't require degrees, the vast
Mhm.
majority. One last thought, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong.
Mhm.
That bridge that has had that failure in Tennessee, the crack that is now shut down for months and has millions of dollars disruption in business and shipping and all that. That bridge was a okay bridge, correct? That wasn't one of the
It was
most
not.
troubled bridges, let's call it, right?
It was rated fair. Yep, in fair
So,
condition.
so just keep that in mind, folks. That that bridge that we're hearing about, that was one of the better bridges in
Wow.
our inventory, and here we are. So, well, folks, it is 5 o'clock. We are so appreciative, Jeannie and Jonathan, for your time and expertise. Thank you both. Thank you, Rhonda, for your help today and appearances. But most importantly, thank you, folks, for attending today. Please share this recording when it's posted out with your friends and so on. And let's stay together and stay in touch. And we hope to see you at our next
Good
events.
night.
Thank you. Have a
Thanks.
good
Thanks
evening.
everybody for attending.
See you.